In my family's collective history of all-time greatest love stories, there is unanimous agreement about who deserves that honor. You see, without a doubt, my Portuguese grandparents had one of the most beautiful love stories we'd ever heard. Over dinner-time conversations and many family gatherings, the story of how they met would sometimes come up. I suppose through many retellings, some details became exaggerated, and other details have disappeared from the story. But the central plot remains the same. And it went something like this. One day, while waiting at a bus stop in 1949 in Lisbon, my grandfather saw my grandmother cross the street, where she was saying goodbye to a friend. He claims to have fallen almost immediately and madly in love with her, right there. And as the story goes, my grandmother leaves the scene. My grandfather rushes over to her friend and asks for my grandmother's address. Then, the next day, he brazenly puts on his best smile, some nice clothes, and arrives unannounced at my grandmother's apartment to ask her out. Now, my grandfather was quite handsome. He also had this very low, reassuring voice, and he could be extremely charming. Looking at photographs of him at the time, he cuts quite a dashing figure with his chiseled jawbone and his long woolen coat. I can imagine my grandmother, her mother and her sister, who all lived together, were probably more than a little intrigued. A romance to the streets of old Lisbon followed. Sometime later, my grandparents were married in my great-grandmother's apartment with close family and a modest lunch. My grandmother made her own wedding dress, and in one of the photographs, she seems to be looking flirtatiously at my grandfather. This would be the start of their 60-year marriage. My grandparents have both passed away, but before they died, about 15 years ago, my brother and his fiancée visited Lisbon, and they returned to this famous bus stop. It was in the middle of winter, and my grandparents huddled under this shelter looking very sweet and nostalgic. It's a tender moment, and till today it's one of our family's most treasured photographs. So that brave love story that started at this bus stop in Lisbon became the stuff of legend in our family. Now, being quite curious about love stories and quite big on details, I would sometimes ask my grandmother questions about her marriage. One time I asked how long she and my grandfather had dated before they married. She was sewing something at the time, and she stopped what she was doing. She looked up at the ceiling for a few moments, as if she was craning to remember, and she said, about 2 weeks. 2 weeks. That seemed like an especially short time between meeting a stranger at your front door and marrying them. I put this very odd detail down to something being lost in translation. My grandmother sometimes, she struggled with English words, and I remember once she screamed at my brother to stop being such a rubbish. So this could have meant 2 months or even 2 years, but surely not 2 weeks. On another occasion, after a breakup, I asked my grandmother, "What is the secret to a great marriage?" And she replied with only one word: work. It's a lot of work. This seemed like a remarkably sober thing to say for her, because if anyone was into romance stories, it was my grandmother, and she had a collection of romance novels to prove it. But more on this later. In any case, these were only minor details in the greatest family love story of all time because, as it was, my grandparents would still call each other darling after decades of marriage, and they would steal kisses from each other in the lounge. They completely adored each other, and you didn't have to be family to know that. More recently, though, I've returned to some of my questions about this love story as part of a bigger project. I've researched the phenomenon of burnout, which I'll get to a little later. I've been rather meticulously going through the details of my grandparents' marriage as part of my research. What I discovered has shocked me to my core. You see, there exists a completely different love story about how my grandparents met that reads nothing like the original. But it's also true. It's like what storyteller Chinua Achebe said. There is no story that is not true. So tonight, I'm going to tell you the other true story of what happened at that bus stop in Lisbon in 1949. It involves quite some detours, so I ask for your patience over the next 40 minutes. We will travel to many places quite far away, including South Africa. There are some lies, some deception. There will also be some extremely awkward first meetings. There's for sure some violence in this story, but not always of the physical kind. We will meet an introvert politician and a world record novelist, and we will come across some very, very tired bodies. But there will also be love, because this is, after all, a love story. First, though, the story requires that we go back to 1949, and we will start with a newspaper advert. It was while he was sitting with his sister one afternoon that my grandfather decided it was time to meet a wife. He was almost 26 years old, and in Portuguese family terms, that equates to an emergency. He was, for sure, nearing the end of marriage marketability age. He didn't seem to have any regrets, though. His life so far had been one large transcontinental adventure, starting when he left Portugal as a teenager to join his father in Mozambique, later moving to neighboring South Africa. It was the stuff of young dreams. To a European eye, South Africa was an epic, pioneering ride with lots of opportunities for entrepreneurial, hard-working migrants. My grandfather did work hard. He trained to be a welder, and he learned enough English to get by. He even spent time on a Portuguese ship, and he traveled to Venezuela. But maybe the timing felt right now. Maybe he was lonely. But in that year, 1949, he only had one goal: to meet a wife. He booked a ticket on a ship bound for Lisbon. Now it's here, on the eve of his departure from South Africa to Portugal, that my story runs a little dry on details. I know that my grandfather packed a suitcase and he boarded a ship for Portugal. But what was his strategy for finding a wife? I've tried to imagine what dating in post-war Europe might look like in the late 1940s. Maybe some romantic dance hall parties, brimming with young people making eyes at each other across the room. Or terrace cafes with young, pretty people flirting and exchanging addresses. In my mind, Lisbon was one giant rom-com movie, with colorful characters who flirt, they laugh, they dance, they sip long drinks on hot Lisbon summer nights. So was my grandfather at those cafes, hoping to meet someone? He didn't seem like a dancey kind of guy, let alone a cafe person. He never drank. He wasn't terribly chatty. He had very little money. Yet, he was looking for a wife, and he wasn't leaving until he found her. I can imagine him waiting at this magical bus stop, then spotting my grandmother in the distance, feeling his heart pounding, the sheer joy of some instant love. This romantic fable, though, needed more details, so I called my mother. "Mom, do you know anything about this trip that Grandpa took?" She didn't, but she promised to speak to her aunt, my grandfather's sister, and get back to me.
Grandpa and his family were living in South Africa at the time, right? And they teased him a little bit about the fact that he was 26 years old and no wife. Goodness. So he thought, you know what, I'm going to have to do something about this. Mm-hmm. So his father suggested that he put an advert, in the Portuguese newspaper, and the advert went something like this. Rich Portuguese man from South Africa looking for a wife. If interested, please send a photo. Well, you can imagine the family had such a good laugh about this. First of all, to look for a wife like this, which was not uncommon in those days.
Wait, Mom, hold on. Just hold on a sec. Grandpa placed an advert in a newspaper.
Yes, he did. Yes, it was what some people used to do in those days. I mean, today we have internet, etc., but in those days, that's the way they used to do it.
So, as it turns out, my family's greatest version of the greatest love story of all time seems to have some details missing. And indeed, in 1949, my grandfather did place an advert in a Portuguese newspaper, and it read, "Rich Portuguese man from South Africa looking for a wife. If interested, please send a photo." The newspaper circulated in Lisbon and any other country where Portuguese colonial communities had settled. I tried to imagine what it might be like to read an advert like this in the newspaper, and what might motivate a woman to respond. Was it the rich man part? By the way, my grandfather was not rich, and that was just a lie. Or was it maybe the South Africa part? After all, South Africa was, and still is, a place of exoticism for colonially minded Europeans. Seemed like this newspaper advert was a radical version of Tinder, but seemed also much more transactional. I can't imagine too many Tinder profiles with the word "man seeks wife." Or, more accurately, "Man seeks wife to travel 3 weeks on a ship between 2 continents to live in a place you've never been before with a man you hardly know. Please send a photo." And what about language? A Portuguese woman would have to at least be able to speak English to live in South Africa. So this whole thing didn't seem plausible or realistic. Actually, it was borderline absurd. I couldn't imagine that anyone would respond to this advert. So I asked my mother again.
There were a lot of girls that replied to the advert in the paper, you know. A lot of girls sent photographs of themselves in costumes or dresses or whatever. And every day, his family would run to the post office to get the next lot of letters and to look at the next lot of photographs. And then they would pick and choose, "Oh, this one's not so nice, that one's lovely, that one's lovely." And so that's how they used to. And they had a wonderful time. Eventually, they picked one photograph of a girl that they liked, and they said, "This is nice." Anyway, so he took the photograph with him, and off he went to Lisbon.
As my great-aunt recalls, about 200 women responded to my grandfather's advert for a wife, and after some deliberation around the family kitchen table, the winning photograph was selected. I've tried to imagine what this photo might look like. Who exactly might have pierced my grandfather's heart? Well, I've had some time during my research to dig a little deeper into this question. I've inherited all my grandparents' photo albums that document their entire lives, first living in Portugal and later moving to South Africa as a migrant couple. My own family history is entangled with the history of the Portuguese diaspora, as millions of men and women and children left their country to find a better life in America, Canada, the Azores, Goa, South Africa, Mozambique, Angola, or Guinea-Bissau in West Africa. I've had some time as part of a fellowship I did at Het Nieuwe Institute in Rotterdam in 2018 and 19 to look at these albums, not only as beautiful specimens of family photography, but as a rich archive of gender relations, migrant life, and conditions of work. The albums have been my narrative starting point for a cultural study, to tell a story about women, a very specific group of women whose experiences have been largely invisible until now. More specifically, I'm looking at how some Portuguese women burnt out as part of their voyages of love and adventure to South Africa. They are women who were part of arranged marriages or were married by proxy, or, like my grandparents, met through an advert in the newspaper. But I'm getting ahead of myself because you're here for a story about love. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to return to the love. We might think that finding love, as it turns out, is quite simple. Easy, even. You write an advert, you place it in the newspaper, and women send you photos. You pick one, you think she's beautiful, she somehow resonates with you, you meet up, you propose marriage, you have kids, you adopt 3 stray dogs, you live in a small but comfortable enough apartment, you grow old together. One night in your late 80s, you hold hands, you fall asleep together, and never wake up again. The end. But this is not that story. This story seeks a different narrative, one with a partial perspective. We will try to examine notions of love and marriage through the words, the eyes, and the bodies of women. There is no master narrative here, no authority voice. Rather, we find multiple truths and many different versions of the same story. Maybe we can't even be sure what is fiction and what is real, and this is what makes the story so compelling. So while my grandfather was traveling from South Africa to Lisbon in 1949, women in Portugal were living under the regime of Prime Minister António Salazar. Salazar was a lonely Portuguese introvert and a devout Catholic with big political dreams. As a boy, he desperately wanted to become a priest. As a man, he was an economics wizard. He had no apparent sense of humor. He liked to attend church every day, and he counted Mussolini, Hitler, and Franco as his friends. Despite his quiet personality, he held Portugal in an iron grip, with most of the Portuguese population poor and illiterate for 40 years. He once remarked that the Portuguese must be treated as children. Too much, too often, would spoil them. His favorite 5 values were God, country, authority, family, and work. And he reminded people often that his life was his work. Salazar never found love or a wife. He lived in a simple stone house in Lisbon, which had a passage to the neighboring Catholic church where he would often pray. Rising to power in 1932, he was responsible for the ultra-conservative New State, or Estado Novo in Portuguese. Salazar had a special focus on women as part of this new way of life, deeply rooted in moral and religious codes. Within 1 year, he oversaw a new constitution and equality for citizens before the law, except for women, who he claimed were different due to their nature. In 1939, he introduced a civil code which gave privileges to a husband, that he may insist that his wife remain in the home. Under the same civil code, women were not allowed to own anything or to divorce from a cheating husband. By contrast, Portuguese law overlooked men who murdered their cheating wives. Women were denied jobs in the judiciary, municipal and village councils. Women's job training was limited to feminine skills only. In 1946, Salazar even proposed a law that denied women the right to vote. It wasn't passed. But he did make women pay extra tax for their right to vote. Until 1969, Portuguese women could not travel without the permission of their husband. Women were only allowed their own passports after 1974. Under Salazar, education was given limited priority, but most especially for working-class women. And by 1970, the vast majority of Portuguese women over 50 could not read. To be a woman in Portugal during Salazar's 40 years of rule was to be chaste, virtuous, feminine, poor, mostly unskilled, illiterate, and obedient. So it makes sense then that if you met a young, handsome man from a faraway place, it might seem like quite an attractive idea to many Portuguese women. After 3 weeks of traveling by ship from South Africa, my grandfather stepped onto the docks at the harbour of Lisbon in November 1949. The lady he had chosen from the responses to his advert was living with her parents in one of the suburbs. My great-aunt told me that he held the photo of this lady very close to his chest throughout the journey. I can see him taking it out of his pocket and showing it to fellow passengers. He was on his way to meet her. He was hoping for the best. The chance of love, possibility of marriage. I can imagine people wishing him good luck. Oh, but she's so beautiful. All the best. He headed into the city, excited at the prospect of his meeting. His goal was crystallizing. The moment was near. Meanwhile, in the city, this young lady, whose name we don't know, was getting ready to meet my grandfather. She felt nervous, but also excited. She'd been living at home with her parents. Her father was a violent and very cruel man. This was indeed her moment for escape. Feeling incredibly apprehensive about the meetup, she decided to ask a friend to come along for support. The agreed meeting place was a bus stop, not too far from where she lived. My grandfather was punctual as usual, so he arrived at the bus stop and cast his eyes over the neighborhood. The winter was closing in on Lisbon, and the sky might have been an overcast grey. He was missing the sunshine and the warmth of South Africa. Just then, 2 women made their way over to him. The first was from the photograph. He recognized her immediately. But the other lady, her friend, was completely enchanting. While he spoke with them, all he could think about was how he might get the contact details of this friend, who, you might have guessed by now, this friend was to become my grandmother. So after their meeting at the bus stop, the women crossed the street, said their last goodbyes, and parted ways. My grandfather, feeling conflicted and brave at the same time, rushed across to stop his date from leaving. He had to be honest with her. I would really love to see your friend again. And this is how he came to have the address of my grandmother in Lisbon. I'm incredibly intrigued by this lady in the photograph, who must have been bitterly disappointed at what happened that day. I wondered too how the conversation might have unfolded between my grandmother and her. I often wondered what she might have looked like. I combed through the albums of my grandparents for evidence of any photograph that might stand out from the rest as being particularly well-traveled. And one day, I found it. There was no inscription, no date, just a plain brown photograph, very creased, worn, potentially from being kept in my grandfather's pocket. A uniformed lady in a somber pose, staring somewhat intensely into the camera. Her outfit is neat. The only sign of disorder is her cap, which sits at a cheeky side angle. Her mouth is neutral, unsmiling. I've pieced together the timeline of my grandparents' marriage, and it is true. My grandmother dated my grandfather for only 2 weeks before they were married. They did have a wonderful but modest wedding lunch, and then, in my mother's words, they sailed off into the sunset, back to South Africa. But as we know, dear friends, these stories rarely end with a ship sailing into a sunset. There are devils in the details. I was so taken aback by this new version of the all-time greatest love story, I craved more details. I became convinced that I could find my grandfather's 70-year-old advert in the newspaper archives in Lisbon. I asked a gender studies student, Alice Azevedo, to help me. There can't be that many adverts. Alice agreed to come back to me after a few days. Dear Natalie, I hope you're doing well. Today I spent more than 8 hours in the newspaper archive. The room is dark and small. I'm currently busy with 1949, but it would really help me if you had more details about your grandfather's advert. Do you know what month and day he placed it exactly? I ask because there are literally thousands of adverts from men seeking wives. It's like finding a needle in a haystack. Love, Alice. Dear Alice. I'm not sure what you mean when you say literally thousands of adverts. Are you being serious? Love, Natalie. Dear Natalie. I could spend the rest of my life in this archive looking for your grandfather's advert. In the last day alone, I've only covered 1 week in 1949. I've attached a few examples. Love, Alice. Gentlemen. Young, here on vacation and intending to return shortly to Africa, wishes to marry girl from 18 to 26 years old, honest and good-looking, cultured. Send photo and information. Marriage, gentleman with good situation, departing for Africa, wishes to consort with young lady, pleasant and of good family, that wouldn't mind accompanying him. Business of maximum seriousness. Answer urgently. Marriage, Africa. Gentleman, 28 years old, good position, wishes for matrimonial ends to relate with lady from 20 to 30 years old, cultured, honest, no matter if poor, preference if from province, photograph welcome, urgent and serious issue. Marriage, young lady, divorced, cultured, recently hurt by family heartbreak, intends to relate for matrimonial ends with gentleman from 38 to 48 years old, cultured, good social standing, preferably residing in Africa. It is requested to only answer if all mentioned conditions are met. Rigorous mutual references. And here is when it dawned on me that as much as we like to think that our stories are unique, that we are somehow special, in fact, we are only ever tiny spots in the collective motions of desire, loneliness, love, seeking, reaching. The story of my grandfather's advert led me to one of the most interesting archives of this project, an enormous treasure chest of desperately seeking hearts. It was here in this very small, weird, dark room in the National Newspaper Archives of Lisbon that the only evidence exists of many thousands of women who migrated from mainland Portugal to Africa. Their stories are invisible, untold. There is virtually nothing written about this migration of love. Many of these women landed up in South Africa, and oftentimes they would marry by proxy. This meant that women would appear in a magistrate's court in Portugal with a complete stranger who would stand in for their future husband. After they were married, they would travel a few weeks on a ship to South Africa, a country they'd never been before. Stepping off the ship, many women thought they were about to meet a dashing, handsome Portuguese pioneer. This was their supposed escape hatch from poverty and oppression. I often wondered in the course of my research if love was an optional extra in these arranged or semi-arranged marriages. Or more specifically, I wondered, what did love look like? I read the story of an 18-year-old Portuguese woman who arrived in Cape Town to meet her 42-year-old husband for the first time. When women responded to advertisements or as part of arranged marriages, they were expected to work in their husbands' shops. They were never paid for their time, and they often worked more than 12 hours a day. After working in the shop, they cleaned the house, they did all the cooking, and put the children to bed. Often these women couldn't speak English, and they were isolated from the broader South African community. Sometimes they lived in remote places with little or no access to culture or support networks. Their families were on a different continent. They couldn't travel without the permission of their husband. And often this first phase of life in South Africa came with a period of mourning the loss of their previous life. Portuguese women were sometimes depressed and even hospitalized. I began to think that these adverts in the newspaper placed by Portuguese men blurred the categories of wife and worker. My own grandmother, although in a very happy marriage, was burnt out by the age of 35. One day in 1960, she simply couldn't get out of bed. The doctor diagnosed her with severe nervous exhaustion from overwork. He recommended a holiday for 1 year. My grandfather took this news very seriously. He sold the shops and the family went to Portugal for a year. This point in the story I have to tell you is not clear to everyone. Indeed, it wasn't a story the family shared easily. Instead, it spoke through the photo archive, through images I found of landscapes that seemed to say, I need a sense of calm. My grandmother's tired eyes were looking for a moment of clarity and rest in the ocean or the beach. In these images, in the archive, she's not really present, more of a shadow. These images really pierce the heart a little because they are different. I love these photos. They look like Instagram, 50 years before Instagram. They're printed on Polaroid paper. They mark a moment, a pause. Sometimes these empty spaces, these pictures of wide open spaces, they seem to speak the loudest. The rest of the archive proceeds as usual. The year passes, the family moves back to South Africa, and the work starts all over again, documented and photographed, building a new home, making Sunday lunches for friends, traveling to see relatives, going to church, trading in the store, repairing bicycles. In one of my interviews for this research, a Portuguese man now in his 80s told me that in South Africa in the late 1940s, young men were adventure seekers, even troublemakers, but of the good kind. But when they found a wife, that's when their good life started. Because when you had a wife, you were virtuous and whole. This anecdote brings me to my grandmother's other great love, the British romance novelist Barbara Cartland. When my grandparents passed away, my mother, my aunt, and I spent many hours packing up their apartment. Amongst all their things, we found hundreds of these novels that my grandmother treasured. Now, Barbara Cartland is in the story not only because she was my grandmother's favorite author, She also epitomizes the nuclear work ethic of women. She holds the Guinness World Record for most number of books written in 1 year. In her long and colorful life, she wrote over 700 novels, many of them with female characters who were virtuous and wholesome, and their daring, adventurous lovers. Her titles included Stars in My Heart, The Reluctant Bride, The Problems of Love, Love in the Dark, and my personal favorite, The Bored Bridegroom.
Barbara, I feel that we must be intruding because you must have got a very tight schedule. You're very busy always, aren't you?
Yes, terribly.
Does it all begin here?
It all begins here in the morning when I'm not called till quarter to 9, actually, myself, with my breakfast. But the dog is taken out at 8, and then the other one's taken out at 8:15. So you can imagine I'm awake. You know what I mean? Because they sleep with me.
They do?
Yes.
On your bed? On this
This one sleeps on the bed when he doesn't sleep in the fireplace. He prefers the fireplace. It's cooler. This one has baskets, you see. And then, of course, I have my secretary up, and we have all these massive letters. I do now have a separate secretary for my 10,000 health letters I do a year. Because it's really got
10,000 letters.
This is unpaid, unthanked. This is my penance for all the fun I have and other things, that I really do that as a tool, you know, to help other people.
But are you sort of, I don't know, let's put it this way, very, very efficient with your time? You'd never spare, you'd never waste time.
Well, I can't afford to, you see. I mean, after all, I did the world record with books last year. I wrote 21 books last year and 20 the year before. It's a world record twice. And I'm now on my 10th book since Christmas. And the thing is that I have to work entirely to time. And I'm called on the stroke, you know, the secretaries come in, the first secretary comes in on the stroke. I do my letters exactly. I get up at the same time. I take the dogs for a walk, settle down, have my lunch and start my work. It all works like that.
You've got to have people helping you, haven't you?
Oh, yes. I mean, we're a factory now. I have 5 secretaries who are full-time here. I have a great many people who read, who type, and do things outside. I mean, it really is a sort of factory. And Mrs. Clark, dear, that last chapter, I made a note here. There's some alteration, my fault, not yours, in the last chapter, if you can just alter it around.
Yes, certainly.
And there's a spelling mistake on page 3.
But you've written such an astonishing amount of books that what really makes me wonder is why you go on writing them, Barbara.
Well, darling, look, I shall be 76 on Saturday. Now, will you tell me what I should do? Sit and wait to be asked to parties, which I hate, play bridge, which I loathe, or be useful in the world. And I think I still have a message. You know, I've been a crusader all my life. I still have a message for the world. I believe I have something to say. And, you know, I believe in purity for women. And this is the thing I've been fighting for. And of course, all my health things. And I think I've got something which people want to hear. In fact, I know they want to hear it because I've now got 80 million books sold over the world. And 45 million in circulation in America, which I take not as a compliment to me, but a compliment to England. For so long time they said, we're not going to have English authors, especially romantic ones. And now the whole of Europe's gone mad on love. It's fascinating. It's the most exciting thing that's happened for a long time. In other words, the pendulum is swinging back from vulgarity, pornography, all the things which degrade women. Make no mistake. It's not men who are degraded by pornography, it's women. We are degraded by pornography. We're swinging back to all the things beautiful, romantic, mysterious about women. It'll take time. Of course it'll take time. But and people write to me and say, when I'm in my kitchen, I think of you and I think of your wonderful dukes and all your beautiful backgrounds and everything is beautiful. And I feel so much happier.
I've interviewed some of my grandmother's friends as part of my research, and they all talk very nostalgically about their collections of romance novels. These novels were places where love happened, where love blossomed, and was saved on a big white horse with a handsome prince. I'm convinced that my grandmother not only learned to speak English through Barbara Cartland novels, but also confirmed her ideals of love and, to some extent, womanhood. In marriage, where love was optional, novels presented a place where virtuous and graceful women were adored and pleasured. One time, I told my grandmother I was writing a book, and she excitedly asked, "Is it a romance novel?" And I replied, "Sadly, it's not." And she assured me, "Okay, well, maybe next time." I wish I could tell you that the story has a perfect ending, that love somehow transcends even death. But no, we need closure now. We need to say our goodbyes. Our family's greatest love story of all time finds its ending in an old age home in 2009. My grandfather woke up in the middle of the night, and a security camera positioned above his bed recorded him screaming into the darkness, perhaps with the knowledge that he was dying. His scream woke my grandmother, who shuffled over to his bed and adjusted his blanket. She leaned over to kiss him as he closed his eyes. The rising moon cast a very tepid light over their faces. You see, my dear friends, my grandmother doesn't know yet that her husband has just died. We watch as she returns to her bed and almost immediately falls back to sleep again. The moon continues to rise upwards, and all you could see is the slow rise and fall of her chest. I like to imagine she's dreaming of beautiful, wide open spaces.
Esse caminho passando nem. Quem mostrava esse caminho longe, quem mostrava esse caminho longe, esse caminho passando nem. Saudade, saudade, saudade desse minha terra, San Inclau. Saudade, saudade, saudade desse minha terra, San Inclau. Quem mostrava esse caminho longe, quem mostrava esse caminho longe, esse caminho passando bem. Quem mostrava esse caminho longe, quem mostrava esse caminho longe, esse caminho passando bem. Saudade, saudade, saudade desse minha terra, San Inclau. Saudade.
Thank you very much, Nathalie.
Okay.
Nathalie Dixon is founder and Cultural Insights Director at Affect Lab, a women-led creative studio and research practice based in Amsterdam. She's winner of the Dutch Design Award 2021. Congratulations again. Together with Clausine van der Zandschulp. And in her work, as you have been able to witness, she explores questions of gender, race and belonging through the lens of technology. She's fascinated by people's attachments to their technology and and how they develop feelings and relationships by using their devices. And central in her work is always the body. She was research fellow at het Nieuwe Instituut and also is having a PhD in media studies, which was entitled Affective Mooring, and I was honored to be part of that in a very humble way. Thank you again for this beautiful reading and this extremely rich and thick story, and this anthropological term. To cut to the chase, you said this before, and you in a way seem to stress this, that this newspaper exploration of desiring hearts, which are also motivated by economic pressure, which is pressured by like a less than desirable political situation. This whole mechanism, to what extent is that similar to the commodification that has been, for instance, addressed in the conversation that we witnessed an hour ago? This, the current situation in which the relationship market is platformized and, well, in a certain way simplified. Courtship moved to the screen, you drew this comparison. It also seems profoundly different, but there's also striking similarities. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, so this is a great question because what I noticed in the course of this research is that what we find in newspaper adverts is really the same mechanics of searching, but also turning love into a currency. And that currency travels to different places and for different jobs, and of course is made to do things. And while newspapers are a less, I suppose, viral technology, they work in the same way, right? So this is a very simple story of a kitchen table with photos, you know, where you could imagine a swipe right or a swipe left could easily have occurred, you know, and then the winning photo bubbles up. So I find this interesting that we tend to get obsessed or perhaps fixated on how modern technologies have come to configure our notions of love, but that indeed newspaper adverts from the 1940s did almost exactly the same thing. So it lives in a kind of lineage of media and also relationships and how love has been commodified or commoditized for a very long time.
There's two questions I want to ask as a follow-up. So, and before I forget them, I'll pose them now, but then we can go back to them later. So one of them is then, to what extent this the current situation is fundamentally different also, and do you, because this is also part of your research, would you be able to expand on that? And the other one, to what extent you insist on calling this a love story, and there is something in the relationship between your grandparents that merits this description, that merits this label, but it seems to be, to go back also to a question that was asked in the previous conversation, it's a highly contextualized authenticity of love. It's the feeling of love is mobilized to so many other pressures.
Yeah.
So to what extent, and you addressed this also by bringing up Barbara Cartland, so the codified experience of love is also what keeps it going. It needs a regular infuse of Barbara Cartland to be able to go on, it seems. Otherwise it's unmasked as this much more bleaker transactional situation.
You said it so beautifully.
Sorry, I didn't want to shut up.
I also think that affect, that was also in the previous talk, as a different term, more academic-y term for emotion, but it's slightly different, is that it is sticky and it moves and it travels to places. And to answer your question, what's different now is that we have this massive acceleration, and this time is different. You know, so you would have had to travel 3 weeks on a ship, but there's no coming back from that. You know, so yeah, I think this kind of affect that sticks to bodies. You know, the ideals of love and the kind of affect that it generates, you know, in the Barbara Cartland novels, and it sticks with you and you travel all the way. But the reality is that continues to morph into other things. So it becomes a disappointment and maybe disgust at some point. But that these emotions seem to circulate around bodies, but especially in this story, the bodies of women. And I find that this was, I think, a point in Eva's talk as well, that I think women are at the center of these love stories more and more for the reason that I mentioned, you know, this kind of burnout at the end of love, this ideal of what love is, and then the reality of that moment.
But that seems to suggest that the women in these stories did not realize it was actually also very much a labor transaction.
I don't know what women were thinking, except to get out of Lisbon.
Right. Well,
there was transaction on their side too. You know, this was a way out. I think it went both ways, but I think very little was known about what to expect. So this story of an 18-year-old woman who got off the ship and was on the docks and met her 42-year-old husband for the first time, you know, the story doesn't end well. I can't keep all the stories in this 45-minute performance lecture. It's too much. But there are many documents that exist of psychiatric wards filled with women who just weren't able to manage these disparate moments of what they expected. And this is another thing that came up earlier, this anticipation, this expectation, you know, of what love is, you know. Isn't he handsome? Or it's also very hetero, but I mean, handsome, hetero love that is nothing. In the same way as the story is nothing like you are told. You know, it turns out to be something very different.
So, given the standards of the day, do you think your grandparents had what is known as a good marriage? Do you? I mean, what I'm asking is like, again, is this question of authenticity? Is this, given all those contexts, given all those pressures, and you mentioned you believed that the word love, let's say, was legitimate, that we can call this.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? Who the hell knows what a good marriage is?
No, I mean, given this,
can't
and
answer
I'm
that.
not judging it as good. I'm asking, like, for the standards of the day, like, was this considered a good marriage?
You know, I think this what I'm trying to also illustrate is this kind of myth around what a good marriage is, and the kind of attributes and myths that go with the mythologies of good marriage or love stories that become bigger and greater than the reality or the so-called truth. You know. So
yeah, but that's exactly the question, because it also seems they're able to inhabit this myth, and it's not only something that escapes them. I mean, I'm just feeding back what you read. I don't know your story, of course, to the extent that you know it, but there seems to be something that it was a little bit more than like play. So again, sorry, I'm using the framework of the previous conversation a lot, the lecture that was here an hour ago. The moment of authenticity, the idea of authenticity emerges when something gets really uncomfortable. So it's authenticity is something that plays out in context. So it comes. So in that sense, it seems to be you're trying to say that given all these pressures, given all this rather cynical feminist Marxist analysis, like this is really not for. Yes, we need.
Despite all of that.
Despite all of that, they were both able to inhabit this idea of this is actually pretty good.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then, but then this burnout happens.
Yes. So now this is the breakdown of the body. So what you said about how I'm interested in media also, and also I like to look at the body as a source of inspiration for research. You know, and this breakdown was pretty spectacular. And I think personally, I'm also very interested in intergenerational trauma and how the cells of my own grandmother live in my own body, and my own propensity for a burnout is always lurking in the background. That's a separate story. But this breakdown of the body was silenced and oppressed in many ways. So what I'm doing here is the story is to unarchive and unexcavate.
This is the bus stop.
This is the bus stop. Wow. This my husband, who's a cartographer, was able to piece together through a crazy amount of SMS codes that live on these buses, and then somehow miraculously piece it together. This was cartographic magic, but I managed to track it down. This took a while, but here it is,
But say it again, what are you trying to do here?
If stories get submerged, they become silenced. They live under more dominant narratives. So the story of how the Portuguese came to South Africa is often told from the pioneering male perspective. So we don't hear the stories of women. We never get told the stories of how they get, how their bodies are broken down and land up in psychiatric wards. But I'm trying now, as part of a more collective project, not only my own story, but how to tell a her story, not a his story, in the more feminist tradition, and inviting other women to tell stories through vernacular photography. So to bring their photo albums to workshops. It is part of a project that includes machine learning and various other technologies as a narrative starting point, in the same way as I've done here, to take the album as the start of a bigger story. And so this was a workshop we did last weekend in Utrecht at the Voorkamer. And these women began their own stories with the toolkit that we're developing. I think the real goal of this project is never to do one story,
Right.
but in the more feminist tradition to really open it up to a collective. Yeah.
Could you go a little bit further in that, not maybe particular the idea of burnout or the experience of burnout of your grandmother, but also here's another, let's say, strong parallel, the experience of Portuguese women in South Africa going through all these pressures, leading a life under and navigating all these complicated spaces with of identity, lack of belonging, or maybe belonging in a small circle, having to perform this Barbara Cartland version while working day and night, etc., and then at some point giving up. And the current, let's say, or since maybe the rise of social media, a rise of a new kind of wave of burnouts, which, so there seem strong parallels.
Yeah.
Could you expand on that also, maybe through, then again, through the her story, not a generalized objective perspective, but a her story perspective?
Yeah, in my analysis of what happens...
By the way, there is a possibility to ask questions. Otherwise, I'm filling the time, which is fine with me, but maybe you want to...
I would like to see if there's some questions.
Yes, and then the 1 minute. Yes, thank you. Sorry,
Yeah.
there's a very little time for very quick questions. Maybe first answer this one, and then we can have one or two. You can send them at questions@impact.nl, right? And if you have a question, please raise your hand, and then the mic will be thrown to you. Sorry. Yeah, this is better. Yeah.
Okay, let me test that. Can you hear me well? Yeah, first of all, thanks a lot for sharing your story. It was really beautiful. My question would be, would you read out loud the story of your own marriage?
The story of your own marriage, yeah?
If there is one.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Would that make a good story?
Yeah, definitely. Make an excellent story, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for that idea. Yeah.
On the way back, yeah.
Hi. Do you hear that there are multiple versions of the story of your marriage that could be told?
Yeah. Of course, I think the story is also very illustrative of that every story has multiple or partial perspectives, you know, so there's no one truth, and I've never subscribed to that. So my own story would also have multiple truths or partial perspectives or different versions. I do believe that, yeah.
And do you think you as a person who is in the middle of that experience can actually see different perspectives of that same story?
No, I think I would only be able to tell from the embodied reality of my own experiences, yeah.
Hi. Can you imagine, well, actually, if I made this comparison with buying a vase, auction style, just being offered one, and the current dynamics of social media, dating sites, you get a lot of options, and that kind of devaluates what is on offer. I'm curious to hear what you think about that analogy, that metaphor, but also, can you imagine that your grandfather had several dates in Lisbon? I can imagine you like to believe, okay, he had one date, and then okay, he went for the friend, but he might have had several dates. It might already have been this not auction style, but the other. So, two questions in one.
Yeah, that was really great. I loved this, this experiment, sociology experiment. And indeed, I think it helped that the choices were bounded to these 200 photos, because I think now we're in this highly accelerated paradox of choice where we just keep scrolling or swiping. But yes, I'm sure there were multiple dates. This is another story, right? This is a whole other version of truth. I imagine that if I kept digging, I only had 6 months at the Newer Institute to do this research, that of course there would be many other aspects or dimensions or story versions. But I love that idea. Thanks for embroidering on the story. Yeah.
I'm told time's up, but Arjen, is it okay if you take one more question?
I'd like you to dive a little bit deeper into, all the workshops you're doing. I mean, what's your objective and how do you approach them? I mean, can you tell a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the starting point was this story. And I work as part of Affect Lab, and my creative partner, Classine van der Zandskop, she said to me, it's really an opportunity to use the tools that you have and open it up to more women to tell similar or stories of migration. So these are predominantly stories of migration. These are women mostly from Africa, second generation Turkish women, women who have stories to tell about either journeys of love or seeking a better life. So they have a very similar resonance. And we've developed the first artificial intelligence model that can recognize vernacular photography. So these are, family photos, pictures of christenings, birthday parties, and it becomes a start for a story. So it's a narrative prompt. It's doesn't tell the story, but just asks questions, and women are given an entire day to write. And there's food and music and a lot of gezelligheid, and it's supposed to be a safe and great storytelling space. So we put storytellers in conversation with technology to retell a story.
Nice. Yeah. And you're making an archive out of it, or how is it, or is it just the exchange is the objective?
Well, we're building a new archive of stories. Yeah, so those will live on the website. Exactly. This website is only in beta, so you were the first to know about it. tellerherstory.org. So it becomes something bigger from here on in. The first workshop just happened. It was really exciting.
I'm afraid that's it, eh? Thank you very much. Sorry for taking a little bit too much of your time, but thank you for the beautiful questions also. And thank you again, Nathalie, for a fantastic performance reading.
Yeah, thank you.